Welcome to Digging Deeper. Good to have you here tonight. We're continuing our walk through the Bible, and tonight we're talking about Ruth, a woman who says, "Where you go, I'll go too, because I'm with you." It's a beautiful story. You've read it. You certainly may have heard it preached last weekend, and maybe you just know it. It's a story of a woman who is just tremendously dedicated, and it's really a dear and touching story. We're going to dig into that tonight. And I hope that as you read, if you're keeping up with reading, or as you're worshiping on Sunday and listening to us talk through that, and listening to the scriptures related to it, or as you're here tonight, I hope that my prayer is that this walk through the Bible we're doing, which is very interesting and full of all kinds of information, and I want you to have questions all over the place on this. I hope that you are acquiring more than just information. Because the Bible is more than a bunch of information. It is about transformation. The story we're hearing is God's story, is us pulled into God's story. Not just to be informed about it, but to be changed about it. So we're going to continue to march, and I want you to ask me those questions. I want you to watch these videos. I want you to read. I want you to look through your workbook there. And when a question comes to you, be prepared to get it answered. If we don't answer it in our discussion, raise your hand. Because God is working in your life to do something more than fill you with useless information that you can say, I know the answer to that. He's filling you with this information to change you, to transform you, to bring you more deeply into his story. That's what these are about. So bring your great questions. Except Ron. Ron, you don't get to ask any more questions. Bring your great questions because they, I sometimes have answers to them. And if I don't know, I'll ask Ron. Let's begin with that prayer. Dear Jesus, you do call us. And your great story over centuries and centuries and centuries involving millions and now billions of people. You call us into this story to be part of your family, to inform us, to engage us, and to transform us. Jesus, we are so grateful for your kind arms that pull us close. Open our hearts and our minds tonight, that we might know more about you and know more that your heart is for us. We say this in your precious name. Amen.
There was a man named Elimelech and his wife Naomi who lived in Israel during the time when the judges were in charge. There was a great shortage of food in Israel that caused them to move to a foreign country called Moab. Elimelech and Naomi raised 2 sons, and when their sons grew up, they each married women from Moab. Sadly, Naomi's husband and 2 sons died, and Naomi was left alone with her 2 daughter-in-laws. She told them that she was going to move back to Israel, and that they should return to their own families. But one of the women, Ruth, refused to leave Naomi. She said, "Wherever you go, I will go. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God." So Naomi and Ruth moved back to Israel to begin a new life. One day, Ruth went to a field to pick up the grain that the farmers had left behind. Little did she know that the owner of the field was Boaz, a relative of Naomi. Boaz was kind to her and offered her to come find food whenever she wanted. Naomi was getting older, so she came up with a plan to provide for Ruth once she was gone. She suggested that Ruth sneak into Boaz's bedroom while he was sleeping, uncover his feet, and ask him to take care of her. Ruth took Naomi's advice. She uncovered Boaz's feet and laid down next to him. In the middle of the night, Boaz woke up startled. Ruth asked him to care for and protect her. Boaz agreed, but said he needed to first buy the land she lived on so that he would have the right to marry her. So Boaz brought together the decision makers of his town and asked for permission to buy the land. The leaders gave Boaz permission and prayed that God would help Ruth be a great wife. They were married and had a son named Obed, who would soon become the grandfather of one of the greatest leaders Israel had ever known.
How do they do those videos? How do they take Ruth and like drop her and then pull it? How do you do that? It's just fascinating. Are so cool. Well, it's kind of a neat story. It's a story. If you were here on Sunday, you heard it's a story with a happy ending, and you see the happy ending there. Where they get married, and you have little Obed, and Obed becomes David's grandfather. So, just a couple of points here, just to unpack this a little bit. First of all, they're living in Bethlehem, and Lechem means what in Hebrew? Gold star to our front student, Ken. Yes, it means bread. And Beth means house in Israel. So Bethlehem, house of bread, is where this whole story starts. And don't know if I mentioned this on Sunday, but isn't it ironic? House of bread, and Jesus is the bread of God. I mean, that's kind of a cool title. So it begins in Bethlehem about 1,000 years before Jesus comes. And they travel about 200 miles, or therefore, to the place, the kingdom of Moab, which today is part of Jordan, out in the middle of the desert. Now, Moab is a place that was founded long before this. If you know the story of Lot, he was in Sodom and Gomorrah. And Sodom and Gomorrah were not very great places. Sodom and Gomorrah were founded in Moab, which was named after the son who was born to Lot and his daughter. So Scriptures are full of all these great stories here. This is one of the seedier sides of mankind. From Genesis, now Lot went up out of Zoar and lived in the hills with his 2 daughters. This was after Sodom and Gomorrah were wiped out. For he was afraid to live in Zoar. So he lived in a cave with his 2 daughters. And the firstborn said to the younger, "Our father is old, and there is not a man on earth to come in to come in to us after manner of all the earth. Come, let us make our father drink wine, and we will lie with him, that we may preserve offspring from our father." So they made their father drink wine that night, and the rest is history. 9 months later, Moab and Ammon are born, and the Moabites and the Ammonites are the tribes in this part of the world that spend an eternity fighting with each other. Next slide. This is a map. There we go. My clicker's not working well today. This is just a bit of a map that shows where Moab is, and you can see the beauty of Moab. If you like that type of beauty. So, think about it. These are God's people, right? They're in Bethlehem. They're Yahweh worshipers. There's a famine. They get hungry. They hear there's food in Moab. They go to Moab. But, you know, they're people that are set aside to be in God's country, in Canaan, with God's people. A whole country that was purged of all these evil type of people. And so this family is leaving and going into the middle of Moab. And this is what happened. This is what Numbers 25 says about Moab. While Israel was staying at Shittim, and the men began to indulge in sexual immorality with Moabite women. As the Israelites were coming into Canaan, they were staying in this town on the edge of Moab, and they began engaging in immoral stuff with Moabite women, who invited them to the sacrifices of their gods. The people ate the sacrificial meal, and they bowed down before those gods. And so Israel yoked themselves, they connected themselves to the Baals, to the evil gods of Peor. And the Lord's anger burned against them. This was on the way into the promised land. The Lord said to Moses, "Take all the leaders of these people, kill them, and expose them in broad daylight before the Lord, so that the Lord's fierce anger may turn away from Israel." So the people of Israel had already been through Moab and had been infected by them and paid a price for that. So the prophets really spoke harshly about them. Next slide. Let's talk a little bit about who Baal is. Baal is a word in Hebrew that means Lord, and it refers sometimes to the Lord Yahweh. But more likely, it's a generic word for a god that is not Yahweh. And there were different gods. Moloch being this one we see here, who's the god of fire. He is the god of the seasons. He's the god that you would sacrifice something to if there was a drought because you wanted to bring rain, or if there was terrible rain, you sacrificed because you wanted to warm up the weather. He was the principal deity of the land. He's mentioned 143 times in Scripture. Moloch is the fire and sun god, and he was very beneficial when he brought sunshine and rain, and he was very destructive when he brought drought and flood. So he could be mollified with proper behavior, so they thought. And so human sacrifice was not hesitant. They did not hesitate to have human sacrifices because it was so powerful. And there were a lot of different ways they sacrificed humans. The Aztecs used to take adults up and rip their hearts out. They didn't do that here. They tended to sacrifice babies. And what they would do is they would take this big statue of Moloch, and you can see it's actually a furnace. And they would have the hands together, put the baby in Moloch's hands, and they would pull a lever, and Moloch's hands would open up, and baby would be dropped into the furnace below. And just to go one step further, there was a band playing with tambourines and very loud bass percussion instruments to drown out the sounds. I had an interesting conversation with my fellow pastor in Michigan, Pastor Moyer, and I talked about how the evil of Moloch that was consuming the children was drowned out by the sounds of the culture around them, so you didn't have to focus on the fact that this horrible thing was happening. And we both thought it very ironic, on my phone with me, that we have these things in our pockets. How many of you have cell phones in your pockets? Yeah, there we go. We have these things that are designed to consume us and to addict us and to pull our attention into it. And it's not too far from the sounds of the instrumentation that drowned out the cries of the persecuted young people, that we are so consumed with our phone that I would suggest we need to look at, are we paying attention to that at the expense of hearing the sounds of trouble in the culture around us? So that is Baal. And that is why the Lord God was angry at his people for paying attention to him. Next slide. This is a temple of Baal, the temple of Baal in Jordan, before ISIS destroyed it, which they recently did. This next is a picture of a proposed reconstruction of it that they were going to do in London and New York. And it's so funny. Carol's got this look on her face like, seriously? They're going to do that? Yes. It was actually, it was really proposed that they would create a 21st century replica of a 3,000-year-old god that ate babies. Because, I don't know why, but it was proposed. But then sane people, I think, said, no, we're not going to do that. So it hasn't been built, but it still was proposed. Next. So this is the town that Ruth came from. This is the culture that she came out of. When she got back to Bethlehem, this is the stuff, this is the people she came from. And if you remember my little soliloquy last week, reading about the fat king, who got that's just a cool story. But he was a king of Moab. So this is the guy. The Israelites have had terrible experience with these people. But this is where Ruth comes from. She's an outsider. She's certainly inferior, and she is very contaminative of the culture. So they're afraid of her because of that. But she comes into a culture that is pretty messed up. We're looking at the last couple stories in the book of Judges. We have a Levite priest. The Levites were the ones who were in charge of the religious ceremonies, who's worshiping idols. So you got God's priest. It's like having your pastor, worship Baal or whoever. And the other story is about a Levite priest who hands over his concubine to others to be abused, so he won't be harmed. So this is kind of where Israel is. Israel's not pretty and unsullied at this time. This is the culture that this inferior Moabite woman comes into. And she comes into Israel because she loves the Lord Yahweh. So this outsider becomes a proclaimer of who Yahweh is to the people who Yahweh has purposely set aside and made himself known to. It's a beautiful example of how God is not for us. He is for the world. And he invites the outsider. He invites the dirty one. He invites the one who is not made out of our DNA. Because he's inviting them to come into us. And perhaps he's inviting them to teach us. This last slide, I just want to take a moment to, because I think it's interesting. What is it with his feet? Anybody wonder that? Yeah, I knew you'd ask, so I thought I'd better get it from this one. So, you're familiar with the Isaiah passage, and if you're not, you will know it. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord high and exalted, seated on a throne, and the train of his robe filled the temple. You know this passage? So I had to translate this out of Hebrew. It's the one passage I had to translate in Hebrew, so I know this passage. Above him were seraphim, each with 6 wings. With 2 wings they covered their faces, with 2 wings they covered their feet, and with 2 wings they were flying. And they called to one another, remember? Holy, holy, holy. Holy is the Lord Almighty. You know that phrase, Lord. Yes. Holy, holy, holy. So that's where that whole phrase that we sing in liturgy and we sing in holy, holy, holy comes from. It comes from this Isaiah 6 passage where the picture of the Lord filling the temple and the seraphim, these angel creatures with 6 wings. Well, the translation is there are 2 wings that they covered their robe, or they 2 rings that they covered their faces, and 2 wings they used to cover their, well, the word is feet. This is a highly debated part of Hebrew translation. But the feet, the use of the word feet is oftentimes seen as a reference to those parts that are best covered by us, that we would be modest. So feet is not always really feet. It tends to be the private parts. So here we have that same word, feet. And we see this, by the way, in a number of different places in Scripture where the word feet doesn't really make sense. It really is much more of a reference to the genitals. We see this story here, which doesn't make sense, because either there's this custom that we're just not seeing, and it was a custom at the time, or you wouldn't cover somebody's toes, and they it's a chance to make connection with them and to wake them and to be a point of respect. Or it's a way that a young woman who trusted that she would not be abused made a request to get married. So it's a very intimate act. Either way, it's a fairly intimate act. And so we don't really know what's going on here, but it was a way that a woman would say, I am vulnerable, and I would ask for you to cover me in your wing. The garment he's wearing is something that also is the same word for wing, and she's asking him to spread his garment over her and cover her. He was a relative, and he had the power to either empower her or to consign her to a life of poverty. See, Naomi had a piece of land, and that was given to her. And you could not sell land. You could sell the product of the land, but the actual land, it really couldn't be sold. So she was at the point of having to sell her land, the rights to use her land, which essentially sold the land, but correct. Or because she didn't have an income, she didn't have a husband. So by Boaz coming in and buying the rights of the land back for her, it protected her stake in the family. It created the family. And by marrying Naomi, it created a son that had an obligation and the ability to take care of Naomi. So it was a very important thing. If Ruth was to get married, it would protect Ruth and it would protect Naomi. And if she didn't, they could both find themselves destitute and having to sell this land, which they would own, but they'd not have any income from. So Boaz was really a hero. So this whole thing about faith, very controversial, but who knows? Either way, Boaz did the right thing. They got married. They lived happily ever after. And they had a king for a grandson. So how can you go wrong with that? Before we go to Randy Frazee, any questions that come to you? Let's watch the video.
This is your story. This is my story. But most of all, this is the greatest story ever told. This is God's story. In the days when judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, so a man from Bethlehem from Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech, and his wife's name was Naomi. The names of their 2 sons was Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah. They went to Moab and lived there. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, and one was named Orpah and the other Ruth. After they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. When Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, she and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. With her 2 daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. When Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home," but Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me." When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her.
In the lower story, all hope is lost for Naomi. She moved from Bethlehem to Moab with her husband to weather the storm of a famine raging in the land around them at the same time as Gideon's story from the last chapter. Not long after they arrive, her husband dies, but she still has her 2 sons to care for her. While they are in Moab, they both marry Moabite women, and 10 years later, tragically, both of her sons die. In complete emptiness, Naomi decides it's time to go back home to Bethlehem. Her daughter-in-laws decide that they want to go. She begs them not to come, that they will have a better life if they stay in Moab. She finishes her speech with these painful words. "No, my daughters, it's more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has gone out against me. In the lower story, we see that she had lost all hope, and she felt it was all a result of the Lord's doing in the upper story. Naomi was able to convince the one daughter-in-law to stay, but the other, Ruth, insisted that she go. Here's how she put her decision. Where you go, I will go. And where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. She has certainly chose the road less traveled. Life will be extremely hard for Naomi and Ruth. They will likely live in poverty the rest of their life. And to make matters worse, Ruth is a Moabite. The Moabites had oppressed the Israelites for 18 years before Ehud, the judge, delivered them. In the lower story, there was little chance that she would be accepted. Yet out of deep love for her mother-in-law and her well-being, this is the path that she chose. When Naomi and Ruth's sandals crossed into Bethlehem's borders, after being gone for over a decade, the women of the town exclaimed, "Can this be Naomi?" Naomi replied, "Don't call me Naomi. Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty." The word Mara in Hebrew obviously means bitter. She is really convinced that God has orchestrated all of this, and he has, but she just doesn't know how the story will end. Now, Naomi owns land that her husband and sons used to farm. However, Naomi can't manage this property by herself, so she'll be forced to sell her land to pay the bills. And once she does, this will basically be committing her life to servitude. But the bigger, bitter pill to swallow is that the identity of the family is tied to land ownership. If her husband's land is lost, it'll be as though he never existed. So how will two poor single ladies make it in Bethlehem? Well, the Old Testament made a provision for the poor called gleaning. Those who owned land would send the harvesters into the field to gather the crop. Whatever little was left, they were to leave for the poor to glean. This is Ruth's primary way to help and to show love to her aging mother-in-law. She will do the gleaning and hopefully bring home enough for both of them to live on. She randomly picks a field to glean, and the owner shows her favor. Ruth is shocked that she is accepted as an outsider and even given protection. Here's what she asked the owner. "Why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner?" He replies, "I've been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband. How you left your father and mother and your homeland and came to live with the people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." Ruth runs home with her arms filled with food and excitement and shares the story with Naomi over a Thanksgiving meal. Naomi inquires about the identity of the owner, and Ruth tells her that his name is Boaz. Naomi almost has a heart attack. Why? Because Boaz is a close relative. Why is she so excited about that? You see, there is a concept taught in the law, in Deuteronomy 25 to be exact, that states that if a man dies without an heir, the next of kin has the option to marry his widow, love her, take care of her, pay off the financial debts, and redeem the land. This man is called the kinsman redeemer. When they have a child, he is to deed the land to that heir in the name of the deceased husband, thus allowing his name to live on. Essentially, the kinsman redeemer takes on a huge risk and in the end doesn't increase his net worth a single penny. Naomi hasn't been this hopeful in a long time. She takes on the role of a Jewish matchmaker like the one you see in The Fiddler on the Roof. She tells Ruth to take a shower, splash on some Chanel 5, and put on her Sabbath best. She was then to head over to Boaz's house that night, playing the part of Cinderella. She needed to wait until he had finished eating. Never approach a man with an empty stomach. After he went to bed, she was to sneak in and uncover his feet and lie down at the foot of his bed. Boaz would understand exactly what Ruth was doing. It was a nonverbal way of requesting marriage. Ruth does everything Naomi asked of her. And Boaz wakes up startled and asks who she is. She replies, "I am your servant Ruth. Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a kinsman redeemer." Now the word for garment in Hebrew is the same word for wing. When Ruth first met Boaz, he referred to God's wing providing her refuge. Ruth was now asking Boaz to be God's wing to her, and he accepted. He exercised his obligation, and they were married. He not only bought Ruth's widow's land, but all his brother's land and their father's as well. Risking his own estate, didn't add to his personal treasury by one line item, and redeemed them all. What drives a Boaz to turn his attention from his own selfish needs and wants to reach out to an outsider? Well, as it turns out, Boaz, the now strong, wealthy, respected man in Bethlehem, knew what it was like to be an outsider. We learn in another part of the story of the Bible that Boaz's mother is Rahab, the harlot. Rahab was the Canaanite prostitute that provided coverage for Joshua's spies when they were scoping out the land. She risked her life and as a result was adopted into the family of Israel. Boaz knew what it felt like to be an outsider at one time and had it in his heart to reach out to someone else in that same position. As it turns out, that person was Ruth. Ruth and Boaz had a little boy together. That little lad didn't know it yet, but he will inherit the land of his father, Mahlon, whom he never met. He will carry on that family name because of the kind act of Boaz. The women of the town said to Naomi, "Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a kinsman redeemer." In the lower story, Naomi thought her life was over, that God had given up on her. Well, she was mistaken. Naomi took her grandson and cuddled him in her lap. The women of the town spread the gossip. Naomi has a son. What happened to the name Mara? Bitter. I guess it didn't stick. She went back to being called Naomi, which in Hebrew means beautiful. And beautiful her life became. She now had a son to work the land, which meant that the name of her husband, Elimelech, would live on. The little heir's name was Obed, which simply means worker. Sounds like a boring name until you understand the whole story. As overwhelming a turnaround as this is, the good news doesn't stop here. There's more going on in the upper story. At the end of the book of Ruth, we are given the genealogy of Boaz's family. It is here that Obed grows up and has a son named Jesse. Jesse then grows up and has a son named David. And 28 generations later, a little baby is born in a manger in the town of Bethlehem named Jesus. Jesus is the ultimate kinsman redeemer, and he came from the family of an outsider named Ruth. God was not only working above the scene of Ruth's life to provide her earthly needs in the lower story, he was working out his upper story plan with her in mind. He went out of his way to include an outsider, a pagan Moabite in the lineage of Jesus. Now that is extreme acceptance. In the lower story, their life seemed hopeless, with no chance of acceptance. In the upper story, God redeems their lives and accepts them as his own. You know, right now, your story might seem a little hopeless and bitter to the taste. But remember, if you love God and align your life to his purposes, as we learn in Romans 8:28, God is working it all out for the good. So wait patiently for God. Wait patiently for God to unfold his good plan for you.
Yeah, great story. I love that story. We're on page 84 here. In the lower story, all is blank for Naomi. All is lost. May the Lord blank repay you for what you have done. Like that, what she said. Ruth was asking Boaz to be God's wing to her. Boaz knew what it felt like to be an outsider. which, by the way, Dick, where is Dick here? Dick pointed this out to me. He picked that up out of the sermon last week. Naomi means beautiful. What a great story. Just the idea of gleaning. Have you heard that concept before?
Yes.
What do you think of that concept? Is that a little bit foreign to our culture today, isn't it?
Well, we've done a lot of that here in the valley. When the orchards were picked and such, then all you had to do is ask the homeowner, and then they could come in and clean. We used to do that all the time. Peaches, tomatoes, oh yeah.
Really?
Oh yeah.
Just gotta do that before they come in and destroy it all.
Huh.
Before the guys get under.
So that's been a part of our culture.
It is, yeah, very much.
So being a Wall Street capitalist like I was for 20 years, that's like crazy. I mean, yeah, you're going to lose money. I mean, you design your system to maximize every shekel. And so you go in there and you time whatever you have to do so there's nothing left over, because that's inefficient. That's really kind of the way the capitalist system is designed. So this whole idea of gleaning, of caring about people is ridiculous. It's about money. You got money, you got people. You kill all the people, you get the money. Well, you kill all the people. It was a different culture back then. We're going to ask some questions here and go through this, but what struck you from the story? What did God say to you as you read this story?
I was amazed at the faith of Ruth. This is a woman who was not raised knowing God, but she, through Naomi, learned about God and believed.
You're amazed at the faith. She grew up knowing Baal, child sacrifice, and yet through Naomi, she came to know who Yahweh was. Yeah. What amazed you? What amazes you about that?
She, as you stated, she started out worshiping the gods that had baby sacrifices and all that type of thing. She completely did a U-turn and found out that this God is indeed a loving God, and she followed her mother-in-law.
Yeah, she did a U-turn. Yeah. I think it's so easy for us to take for granted who our God is. That He's a God who doesn't ask us to sacrifice babies or whatever. He's a loving God. And we forget that most of the world doesn't have a God.
You owe him. And he's
Yeah, you owe Him. Yeah. Yeah, you're obligated to Him. You better perform and it's really easy to turn our God into that too, isn't it? We can make our God the taskmaster. You better bring your tithe into the temple. You better be here on Sunday. It's so funny. Sometimes some of you will come up and say, Pastor, I'm not going to be here on Sunday. It's like, not that I don't care, but I don't care. It's like, you come and be blessed. Go come and tell me you're sinning here and you're sorry that you have to sin. But I mean, we come because God invites us, not because we're earning anything from that. And it's so easy. Our tendency is to want to mollify our God and to see Him as that demanding. It's just our nature to do that. I do care if you're not here, so you can tell me you're not here. Anybody else? What else struck you from this story today?
I think just how God works in such strange ways. Who would have thought? From this would come Jesus.
Yeah, God works in strange ways. So here He says, go into the land of Canaan, kill everybody, because I want to be pure, and I don't have faith that they're ever going to do anything, that they're ever going to come to me. And yet He brings one of essentially those types of people into the middle of His genealogy. Yeah.
If you are a person that has had a lot of struggle in your life, maybe drug addiction or whatever, and you read this story and you realize just how good God is and how He can make such a difference, I think it would give you a lot of hope that you really could go forward.
Boy. Gives us
raised
hope.
in that environment and everything.
You better love her, the drug addiction people.
Yeah.
That's my speech.
Yeah, our God is a God of hope. And again, it's so easy to forget that. It's so easy to take that for granted as we hear it week in and week out. It's such a wonderful story. Ken?
Along the same lines that Jesus' lineage, going back to David, as you go back 2 more generations, and you have non-Israelites are the parents leading up to the lineage of David. Because Boaz was a Judean, right?
Yeah, he would have been, yes.
Yeah, and she was a Moabite, and that became the direct line of descendants. So even at that time, God was reaching out to the rest of the world already, even though the Israelites were the chosen people. He was open to those that were willing to.
Great concept. He is a God for the world. And the Israelites, he set aside not to have a monopoly on him and not to say, we got him and we figured him out and good luck over there because we're going to take care of ourselves, but rather to be a light to the world at the crossroads of the world to show the world what it means to know Yahweh and to invite them in. And they tended to forget that, invite them in. And we do, and it's so easy for us to do that too. It's just a human tendency.
But you see it also later on in Jesus' life where he reached out, to the woman at the well, or when he talks in parables about the man who was beaten and who took care of him.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very consistent story, isn't it? So he's a very consistent God. And to understand him as a God who's reaching out to the whole world, it just unlocks all kinds of, you just understand what's happening so much differently.
You say consistent, but I felt there was, I think maybe it was mentioned, not predictable.
Not predictable.
You know what I mean? There was not a lot of predictability in those who had worshipped false gods previously. It was just like starting over. But this is another situation we talked, I think, just a little bit about it. There was a whole lot of grace there.
Yeah, a lot of
You know what I
grace.
mean? And it's not predictable that was going to be an outcome.
Yeah,
You know.
there's a book I've mentioned a few of you, The Domestication of God. And we like to make him a predictable kind of puppy and put him on old Shapiro. I got you, God. But he ain't. He's going to do what he is going to do. And we see that happening today. He is not. Page 80. What is Naomi's relationship to Ruth? She's her sister, her cousin, her mother-in-law, her friend. She's her mother-in-law. Yeah. And actually, no longer, now that her son is dead. Number 2, why did Naomi want her name changed to Mara? She lost her husband. The Lord had made her life bitter. She had lost her sons. All of the above.
All of the above.
Right. Ray, what was Ruth's reputation in town amongst the people? She was a woman of noble character. She was a poor widow who gleaned in Boaz's field. She was a young widow looking for a husband. She ran after the younger men in town. She was a woman of noble character. Yes. And when Boaz became Ruth's guardian redeemer, his Goel, what was his relationship to her? He became her guardian, her husband, her employer, her business partner. Yes, her husband there. I'm just going to bounce over here because I liked this. What part of the teaching today encouraged, this is on page 85, what part of Randy's teaching encouraged or challenged you the most? What encouraged or challenged you in this story? Where did God speak to you in this story?
When I read here this question on page 81, it says, how is it tempting to be like Naomi when you face challenges in life?
It's
So-
tempting to be like Naomi when we face challenges in our life. Yeah.
So I see a lot of bitterness when, down on me or, just look down on me. It's not, I'm not in his favor. And then you just develop that bitterness, that depression. You don't see the bigger picture.
Yeah.
You don't see that with that good things can come. And, there's another plan. And I think it's very easy for us to jump in that hole and just...
Jump in that hole, that's a great phrase for it. Yeah. It's very easy for us to fall into that bitterness. How does this relate to original sin?
The bitterness wasn't there before we,
Bitterness wasn't there before Adam and Eve
right,
ate of the apple.
right.
Why is it there after? What's different? What happens what happens when our ancestors ate from the tree? What was the tree? Knowledge of good or evil. So, did we have a knowledge of good and evil before that? So we ate from this tree, and now man has a knowledge of good and evil, and we know what's good, and we know what's evil. Because we know, right?
Right.
For the worst part, people, and we ate from the tree, we have this. And so here is Naomi saying, I know what's evil. This is evil. My husband's dead, my kids are dead, I'm poverty-stricken. Life sucks, and I know it. Is she right? Well, she thinks she is, because we have this, because that's our basic sin. We are able to judge what is good and what is bad. And for sure, this is bad. Except God has a bigger plan. He has an upper story here, doesn't he? And he has good he's going to lavish on her. But can she see it?
Not right there.
Just like Rosalie said, this is where we fall. Because we know what's good, and this certainly is not good. All these deaths and destruction of our family.
Because that's why we have to accept that suffering. Because the biggest one is
And that's why we have to accept our suffering. And that's spoken with a very legalistic, and I get what you're saying, yeah. We are wise to accept our suffering. We are maybe blessed to accept our suffering, because God has plans beyond that for us. But this knowledge of good and evil, man, we know that ain't supposed to happen. And
If we're so smart and we know the difference between good and evil, why do we do evil so much more often?
that's a great question. So I'm not going to let that be a rhetorical question. Why, if we know the difference between good and evil, why do we do evil so often? Why does Mary do evil so often?
No one would like to know that, too.
So why no? Why if we know we can discern? Why do we do that?
For what?
Because we're the selfish.
Temptation, the devil.
Yeah, but we are tempted into it. The devil certainly plays a part, and we're evil. We are inherently built that way that we're going to do that. How many of you are evil? A couple of you. Yeah, see, this is, well, basically I'm a good person. But that person over there, yeah, good Lutherans on. We are evil, but Jesus loves us. We are evil, but we're forgiven.
So do we have to like or enjoy our suffering?
Then it wouldn't be so. That's a long.
That's a great response, yes. Well, that wouldn't be suffering. No, but what does Paul say about suffering? Rejoice in it, rejoice of it. I don't think it means enjoy it, but it means live in it.
Because our suffering tends to bring us back to God, closer to God.
Amen, and I appreciate you saying that, Ken. We live in this world where suffering is unacceptable. We have a drug for it. We have a psychological solution for it. And if you are old, and today it's in Iceland or Norway or one of the Scandinavian countries, if you're 70 years old, you can just off yourself now and say, you know, I've lived a good life. It's only going to be more suffering from here on, and so I'm going to just kill myself because suffering is just not acceptable. That is legal in those countries and Oregon, I think. So, so suffering is just not acceptable. Yet it's the very tool that God will oftentimes let us use to bring us to Him. Again, we have this, we're smart, we know the difference between good and evil, and we know what's bad, and we know what's good because we ate from the tree.
Billy Joel sang about it. You'd rather laugh with the sinners than die with the saints. Sinners were much more fun.
And only the good die young.
I do have a question.
Go ahead.
So you knew a lot about the feet.
Yes.
Can you give us a little more information about the sandal passing? Because I found that to be of interest.
Yeah, that was interesting. Did it pass the
It was very
sandals?
small. It was only one sentence, and I had to go back and look at it.
It was a form of treaty. I really don't know much more than it was a symbolic way of saying that you get to walk in the land now. So here's my sandal.
Only
And so,
one. Yeah.
so it's now a legal. That's right. I don't know, those Israelites, they had kind of goofy. I really don't know the
I'll do
etymology.
the unsafe thing and Google it.
Yes. You never know what you'll find out.
Not right now.
That was just, it was a custom. I don't want to take it much beyond there after my discussion of feet. I just don't. Let's see here, I was looking at page, do we have any other questions that came out of this workbook here? Yeah, we're also talking about the second question there.
You know, I understood that there wasn't a lot about women in the Bible. And by doing this study, there is a lot about women in the Bible. And they did a lot.
Yeah.
They were very much a big part of God's plan.
You know, I say that about a million times because I think you're right. In this age of women empowerment and women are discriminated against, and yeah, that's true in Mad Men. I'm not certain it's true through our history, but it sure was in maybe the 1960s. But you know, there has been discrimination against women, certainly. Women are less powerful. However, you're right. And if you look at, it is a long topic, but you look at the history of Christianity, it changed the role of women drastically. And suddenly women went from being property and chattel and not even counted to being some of the most powerful leaders of the Christian church. And if they weren't leaders, they were certainly highly valued as humans and not subhuman men. So, yeah, there is a lot in the Bible. As a whole, I've got books on that in my library that we will go through sometime. Any last questions here? 7:30.